So, good afternoon. Welcome to this session of the where we would like to put together not only disciplines as we did until now in a dialogue between ethics, life sciences, but also between generations. So we decided in our conference to give space to young researchers so that they could share the projects they are working on in this innovative field. We tried to group the different presentations according to a progression that addresses issues of more general scope today and those dealing with more specific issues tomorrow, particularly with regard to reproductive technologies. But we also had to take into account that some may only be present today and not tomorrow. So the result is what you see in the program. The time of our session now is going to be 40 minutes, and every speaker has 10 minutes, so that we will have the last 10 minutes to have a short exchange with some questions and reactions. So let's start with Oliver Sionta's talk on the limit of knowledge. The title evokes the Socratic principle of wisdom. I know that I don't know. And he is studying biotechnology at the ETH of Zurich. But he himself will say a few words about his curriculum, which is part of the issue that he will present. So, welcome, Oliver, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me as a speaker. My name is Oliver Siontas. I am currently in the last year of my master's degree in biotechnology at the ETH Zurich, as you already said. I did my bachelor's degree also in biotechnology at the Technical University of Berlin in Germany. So most of my academic life I spent in Germany. And my motivation to apply to this prestigious first international conference on the ethics of engineering life was, I must admit, fairly pragmatic. I came here to learn something about bioethics, since dealing with this topic has been left pretty much up to my personal interest, my own goodwill, so to say, in my past study program. Practically speaking, the topic of bioethics has been either introduced to us in a coupled slides at the end of a biotech lecture, and these slides were merely exam relevant, or as an elective course among many other elective courses, of which most were technical courses. Thus, in the fear of missing out some beneficial skills for our future career, students, including me, often chose the technical courses over bioethics. And this is, in my opinion, when I phrase it differently, very dangerous, because, and at this point I would like to quote also a philosopher of my homeland, Greece. I, as somebody who is practically working on a daily basis with gene editing and cell-based engineering techniques, as somebody who is about to become a biotechnologist in the working world very soon, either know that I know nothing about bioethics. And this, in my opinion, beautifully shows the dangers and the dilemma we are running into right now. Coming from the Latin word universitas, which means in Latin a whole, the university was once established as a place for universal education. In the Renaissance, striving to become a homo universalis, an individual that excels in different fields, was once the main motivation for studying. At this time, the university did not specialize in a certain area, but rather trained the student in a broad area of different disciplines ranging from philosophy over theology to science. With the universal ground education, the students could then further continue towards becoming a master of a specific discipline. Later, during industrialization and with the implementation of the concept of division of labor and the growing complexity of professions, this idea of raising little polymaths, little Da Vincis at the university quickly became obsolete. Nowadays, the modern university offers a flood of different degrees and encourages the student to specialize in one certain area early on. What would have been a disgrace for the Renaissance students is now a common endeavor among the modern students. Studying one specific topic for an entirety of an academic career is a totally justified aim nowadays. Along with this change of mind comes also the trend that the humanities and the natural sciences are being increasingly segregated from each other, not only categorically by subdividing the fields into different degree programs, but also spatially by separating the disciplines into different department buildings. In some university cities, it has even come to the point that the natural sciences move to the outskirts for cheaper laboratory facilities, while the humanities remain in the old buildings of the city center. On the one hand, one may argue that this is a needed and unavoidable process regarding the growing complexity of technology and knowledge in general. And as we all know, specialization allows us to master a topic to its very details very thoroughly. And thus the specialization ensures a rapid enhancement of disciplines in each field on its own, from which we all as a society would ultimately benefit. On the other hand, however, this thinking has led me to my current situation that I initially illustrated. And to prove to you that this is not only my case, but rather a common syndrome among the biotech students, I looked into all about 50 bachelor programs and about 30 master programs that are being offered in biotechnology in Germany. And of the total sum of 6,000 ECTS that were given away of the bachelor programs, and also about 6,000 ECTS that were given away from the master programs, less than 1% were given to ethical or philosophical courses that, and I'm talking about mandatory courses, not elective ones, mandatory courses that are forcing the students to deal with the topic of bioethics and to learn about the dangers of the practices. And as we've already heard from the previous speakers, with practices we are talking about great biotechnological advances that did do and will influence life on Earth fundamentally. Today, the genetic code can be sequenced on USB-sized devices, can be altered and edited with high precision with, for example, the technology of CRISPR-Cas, and can be even bent into three-dimensional structures in a technology called DNA origami, or can be used as a hard drive for data storage. Designer cells can be derived at will, as we've heard before, from stem cells, can be grown into mini-organs, so-called organoids, about the topic that Clevers talked about, and they can be even inserted into multicellular organisms and used as living implants for therapy, a topic that Mr. Fußnagel talked about. So the big dreams of mankind, like gene therapy, seem to be visions of a not far too distant future nowadays. However, it is a daily routine that life science students get taught these methodologies and learn about them, and they leave university without any basic ethical education that teaches them awareness for the knowledge. As long as we, in my opinion, as long as we do not implement bioethics as an equally mandatory course to the technical courses in our study plans, we leave a door open to raise biotechnologists with a potential lack of awareness for the dangers of the practices. Maybe it's time now to remind ourselves that universities were places for a fruitful discussion between disciplines, just as the discussion and the controversies we are experiencing here at this conference right now. Even if it may appear against the educational canon to implement a humanitarian course like bioethics into a natural science program like biotechnology, still, and I'm saying it again, the university comes from the Latin word universitas, and that means a whole. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for sharing with us your questions. Of course, the point is how to keep in mind during our work for scientific progress to have the vision of integral human development, to use the words of Pope Francis, which is an issue of formation, and to education in the humanistic dimension that is needed to practice and orienting science and research. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Now we are going to listen to Jacob Schwarz-Lucas.
You got it.
I got it. Jacob has a master's degree in molecular biology in a Swedish university whose name I don't dare to pronounce. And he is also working in a research institute. The name is Invincible Wellbeing. And he will talk about the reducing of suffering through genetic intervention. So the floor is yours, Jacob.
My clicker doesn't seem to be working. There we
No,
go.
you have to.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
There is,
200 years ago, powerful painkillers and surgical anesthetics, synthetic and otherwise, would have seemed absurd. And it would have even seemed sacrilegious to many, and they were interpreted this way by some religious leaders. And today, we take the lack of pain during surgery via use of these anesthetics as routine. So I want to ask the question, might we be similarly mistaken about strongly reducing suffering during even waking life? Okay, so I want you to ask yourself for a minute, what is the worst you've ever felt? For people experiencing cluster headaches, they're often called suicide headaches because they're so painful. Yeah? Thank you. Okay. So, okay, yeah, you'll do the next. So, yeah, for people who have cluster headaches, they're often called suicide headaches because they're so excruciatingly painful that many people who suffer from this rare disease wind up killing themselves. Next. And so there are many cases in which pain is neither necessary nor ennobling or important, and I think that we all agree that this occurs sometimes. Otherwise, we would reject having anesthesia ourselves during surgery. And this is both medically and ethically necessary, regardless of whether we're a human being or an orangutan, as you can see in the picture. Next, please. So there are often times where I personally believe that suffering is not morally ennobling. I think that we're going to have a very wide variety of opinions in the audience about this, but if you were to ask a child who is on chemotherapy or their parent if this suffering is ennobling, I think they would most definitely say it's not, or they would at least opt for to suffer much less. Next, please. Of course, pain can be adaptive. I'm not saying it isn't. However, when we take folk psychology too far and believe that it's always useful and always adaptive and always important, I think that's where we run into trouble. Next, please. So, for instance, if you are a veal calf that is trapped in a very small crate, when you feel pain, you don't have the ability to run away, you don't have the ability to take adaptive action against that pain. Next, please. And similarly, pain isn't even always adaptive in nature either. There are multiple species of naked mole rats, birds, and even sea squirts who have naturally evolved to lack certain pain sensitivities. Next, please. And this is even the case among human beings, rare human beings, albeit. We're in Rome right now, and the Marsili family actually has a mutation in ZFHX2, which even after something as painful as a broken bone, they will recover within seconds and not feel pain anymore. They're normal otherwise. And so what's really interesting is if you actually take the exact same sequence that the Marsilis have and knock it into mice and other animals, they too will have a very similar phenotype. Next, please. But if you're asking, well, how could a human being or how could a non-human animal experience no suffering at all, you might look to the case study of Joanne Cameron. She has mutations in FA, as well as the out region of that genetic region, and it has allowed her to say things like childbirth felt like a tickle. She actually heals faster than the rest of us, and she seems invincible really to all negative experience, everything that we've been able to test so far in her, and that includes anxiety, depression, and as I've mentioned, physical pain. Now, even though she lacks physical pain, she still has a desire to protect herself. So if she's cooking and she burns her arm, for instance, she will retract her arm. And she's lived to the ripe age of 74 so far. She has multiple kids. She's lived a morally and economically productive life. And so it's actually interesting, but there are a much more common SNP in the general population that has much higher pain tolerance due to these FA differences. And just like with the Marsili families, if you knock either Joe Cameron's SNP or this more common variant into animals, they will have very similar phenotypes as well. Next, please. Next, please. So I think what this really says when you talk about knocking in and having the same effects is that suffering is really a species-spanning phenomena, and the mechanisms that underpin it are highly interchangeable at the genetic and even the epigenetic level. Next, please. So genetics is of pain in particular is highly evolutionarily conserved. Now I'm showing you a picture of the Hox gene, which controls segmentation in animals as diverse as from flies to guys, basically. And so this is just a picture that helps illustrate that, even though Hox is not sort of a suffering relevant gene, it is, many of these suffering related genes are very highly evolutionarily conserved. And so I just want to give you a sense of later when I talk about ways that we can reduce both human and non-human suffering, many of these genes are the exact same. Next, please. And so because we can drastically reduce suffering in non-human animals who live on factory farms and suffer in laboratories, I think that we have a moral obligation to do so when it's possible and when it's safe. Many of the models that were developed to understand human suffering can actually be used to help animals themselves. And oftentimes when I'm interviewing scientists about the animal models they've created, and I say, well, you've already created an animal that could suffer drastically less, and including, the work you've done to progress, say, a pharmacological agent that could reduce suffering in humans. And they go, wow, that's a great idea. I never thought of that. So that's why I need to get out here and tell people that this is an option. And so when non-human animal use is inevitable, when animal activists, despite their efforts, have failed to change society, and you have these situations in which maybe moral progress has not caught up to where it could be, I think that welfare enhancement is a really great option for massively reducing suffering. And so really you should think of it as ethically no different than painkillers, like morphine or something else. These agents are exogenous agents, and welfare enhancement is really about endogenous painkillers. So this doesn't necessarily require genetic engineering, and I'll explain more later about that, doesn't actually require changing genetic sequence. And furthermore, it doesn't necessarily require transgenesis, moving genes from one organism to another. You can knock out something that's already there. You don't have to do something more exotic or what may seem extreme to some people. And so I also believe that even if you aren't concerned with the suffering of non-human animals, you should support welfare enhancement because it furthers the science of suffering in general, and that ultimately will benefit human suffering as well. The great thing is that these variants are already available, and they're ripe for replacement and epigenetic therapy as well. So next slide, please. I'm going to quickly go through some of the technical options because I only have 10 minutes, but right here you see a list of examples. Many of these are sort of noxious stimuli, and there are models that oftentimes were created for knocking out these particular genes, everything from heat to noxious chemical burns and things like that. So targeting transient receptor protein channels, or TRP channels, is one option. Next slide. We can also eliminate or drastically reduce, if you want to be philosophically skeptical of, we can massively reduce pain via the deletion of the gene SCN9A or other modifications. Next slide, please. And as I was saying, you can do this non-genetically using sort of epigenetic modifications, and this was actually done for SCN9A in mice, and the mice were otherwise normal, but they had no pain. And that lasted 44 weeks, so nearly a year from just one treatment. Next slide, please. And so what industries might we actually enhance or practice welfare enhancement first? Well, I think it's going to be industries where animals are not consumed for food for humans. Now, there are some exceptions to this, like slick cattle and aquabounty salmon. Aquabounty salmon are already being eaten in Canada and the United States. But probably the safer option, if we want to get people kind of used to this idea of endogenously promoting welfare, it is probably going to be in the laboratory. And we don't necessarily have to start with research subjects themselves, but animals that supply laboratory inputs, like antibodies from rabbits and cell culture media from cattle. And I think any kind of research where the very early stages of research don't require us to use the most sensitive animals. We can instead use suffering-reduced animals. Next slide, please. Okay, and I actually think that welfare enhancement will actually reduce experimental variability in many cases. So it could actually help improve the reliability of our results and the replicability as well. And that's because suffering causes a great deal of physiological as well as behavioral changes in animals. And I'm not saying this is universally the case, that this will always reduce variables, but it could create a few more. But it's certainly an option in our tool belt. And so, it enables us, unlike pharmacological drugs that are systemic in their effects, we can be tissue specific, and we can restrict these effects to times where, say, we were giving an animal an inducible promoter which would kick off the expression of certain genes. Next slide, please. And we can actually let the animals choose if we want. Strangely enough, with inducible promoters, if you make the inducible promoter available via drinking water, for example, the animals can decide to turn on and off certain suffering-relevant genes. Next slide, please. And I don't have time to get in the weeds of this. If people want to talk about it in the QA, that's great. But even research that is designed to study pain behavior may be able to use animals that suffer drastically less, or potentially not at all, via certain genes like AC1, AC8, and P311. I'll just have to ask you to read the paper if you want to know more or talk to me about it. Next slide, please. Next one, please. Yeah. Okay, so with that, this notion that welfare enhancement could eliminate extreme suffering day to day is no longer science fiction. We're not living 200 years ago, and I think some of our assumptions that we could eliminate suffering are much like that of our, other humans that lived 200 years ago. And if we fail to give mercy to the 50 billion domestic non-humans born each year, we are also in effect delaying relief to our fellow humans, our loved ones, and even ourselves. So our organization's vision at Invincible Wellbeing is to phase out extreme suffering, and especially unnecessary and needless suffering. Next slide, please. And so the way that you can help is, if you have animals in your lab and you're curious about, well, what are ways that I could improve their welfare, we encourage you to switch to welfare-enhanced animals. We'd love feedback on our paper. If you want to collaborate or co-author things with us, very open to that. And we need people from all kinds of backgrounds to help implement this. Even though these technical options are already available, they've existed in some cases for decades, doing this at scale is going to require people with a wide variety of backgrounds. And so if you have one of these backgrounds on the slide or know somebody who does, I'd love to be introduced, and I'd love to talk openly about this. So thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you very much, Jacob, for sharing with us the motivation of your research. And of course, the question still remains open about the difference between pain and suffering, which is a major anthropological issue that we have to deal with. But of course, all what can help in establishing better relationship with other living organisms in the ecosystem is most welcome. So thank you very much.
Absolutely brilliant presentations. Congratulations, really. One thing is, both for Oliver and Luisa, actually, they both touched about multidisciplinarity. I think that this is one of the things that must be underlined when I think about the future education of our students everywhere. And we are not used to that simply because we try to simplify the complex things. Things are complex, and we discovered that. So I think that the future will be absolutely finding the way to put at the same table all the stakeholders for addressing issues. That's one of the big lessons that young people should learn. And it's challenging, but we should do that. I'm lucky enough for having worked with a multidisciplinary group for several years. And we were very happy to welcome architects, lawyers, writers, ethicists, movie makers, things like that. And seems funny, but they brought a lot of energy and understanding in complex problems that is not absolutely possible with a specialist approach. That's so. Thank you. For Jacob, very much appreciated. One of the things that I was thinking was we recently have been studying the effect of virtual reality for pain control. And this has brought us to another level of the discussion, because actually virtual reality is a technology and it's based on distraction. So I wonder if this has some implications in your conversation, because what is the threshold for necessary pain? Because pain is a protective mechanism in which we evolve, and we try to prevent things that, if you have a fracture, you better don't move, otherwise it will be worse, that's one thing. But at the same time, having mechanisms like virtual reality, at least in humans, that distract the human being from the sensation of pain is something that let me think, because actually it seems like there are different channels. How do you feel like this? And there's any implication in the experiments you're doing? Thank you.
Yeah, so anything that can reduce suffering in a safe and effective way, I completely support. I don't, and potentially we could even have VR for non-human animals as well. What paradise might look like to us in order to distract us from pain might look very different to a pig. One reason why I think that this genetic approach, as opposed to other, you could say, environmental enhancements or exogenous or environmental, are sort of less extensible than the genetic interventions is that precisely because the genes are so evolutionarily conserved that if we make progress in human suffering, it will help animals. If we make progress with flies or apes or whatever, all of these insights can extend across the tree of life. So I think that one of the core utilities of genes is how extensible they are. So I would think, for every dollar spent on minimizing unnecessary and extreme suffering, that the genetic approach, at least when it comes to non-humans, is probably the most effective and cost efficient. But yes, I support, generally speaking, the desire to reduce suffering.
Do you want to say a word?
No.
Kevin, last question by Kevin, for Kevin.
Thank you. Again, thank you for the presentations. Just a couple of responses to Oliver. Yes, I think a lot of what you say is true, but the scope of the universities is not as bleak as I think you've discovered. Certainly in the United States, the humanities are being integrated into a lot of technical programs there, especially healthcare. But I'd also ask you to check out Nico Coles at Hochschuler-Coburg, because he's doing a lot. I've done some work with him there on bringing more of the ethics and reflection into the technical programs that they have. And then I do think, Carlo, you made a good distinction that would be important for you to address, Jacob, in terms of suffering versus pain, right? So Mike, I'm fascinated to know if Joanne Cameron feels suffering when she sacrifices something for her children. Does she feel suffering if her child is sick, right? Because that'd be different than feeling nociceptive pain, right? Yeah.
So should I have a microphone?
You want to say something?
Thank you for the recommendation, by the way.
Yeah. So I wish I could talk directly to Jo, and I wish she was here to answer for herself. I can give an anecdote of what happened when her mother died. She loved her mother very dearly, and anyone who meets her feels her warmth. She actually worked she's retired now, but she worked as a school teacher for children with developmental disabilities, and she had a kid that would come in every day and say, "I hate you, Jo Cameron," and would spit in her face, literally. Now, most of us, even if we are sagacious and wise and calm, would say, okay, this person has Down syndrome, I'm going to show restraint. But for Jo, I think it's that she just feels the love constantly. And so she said, well, I don't think it's right that you spit in my face, but I don't hate you. And just, this is the ideal way to deal with children. Now, when her mother died, getting back to that, she said that it was, quote, the least sad thing she's ever experienced. And this is not because she doesn't love her mother. It's because she lacks this pain and this suffering, but she stayed by her bedside the whole time, gave her, quote, an iced lolly. We don't really use that terminology in the United States. I assume is it ice cream? But we just watched her pass away. And so she is one of a kind, and applying the lens of our experiences to what it might be like to be someone who's so radically different is just really difficult to do. But generally speaking, I think that pain and suffering are definitely two different things. Physical pain can catalyze sort of the higher order agony, or often in the literature they'll talk about affect or valence. Valence is sort of this axis that runs through many different types of experiences that makes them positive or negative. And I think it's possible, even with pain, that the pain is many different experiences at the same time. So pain is the sensory awareness that there's damage, and that's actually separate from feeling bad about it. And in those mice I was showing you with P311 and AC1 and 8, it is possible to disentangle, and they're doubly dissociable, the feeling bad about your pain and having pain. And there's humans like this, actually, with a disorder called pain asymbolia, And sometimes this is purposefully introduced in cancer patients with the most recalcitrant, horrible pain. It's like a cingulotomy that they'll do. And so you could put their hand in a vice grip, crank it down. They'll feel the coldness of the grip. They'll feel their bones crushing, but they won't actually feel bad about it. So these are alien states to me. I don't know what it's like to be such a person. I'm only intrigued that we can begin to start exploring how to drastically reduce suffering in these cases where it's totally needless, like a veal cow, or I should say calf, because these are males. But but we can talk more.
So I'm afraid that the time is ended, so we are running out of time. We will have a discussion about similar topics in the next sessions. I thank you very much, our speakers. Of course, a lot of questions are still unsolved. I think one of them is the distinction between what is genetically determined and what is culturally educated. So also in this thing of pain and suffering. And one other issue is about formation, and I should use this word, epistemology of complexity. So I think we have to understand how a transdisciplinary dialogue can be. We have to figure out how to improve and move forward in this kind of dialogue. But this is a task we have ahead of us. So thank you very much.